Well, it's that time to finally say adieu to the What If NHL series. And what a series we've seen. We've seen playbacks of the greatest regular season of all time, the 65 win Boston Bruins. We saw a playback of 1994 when Calgary should have taken care of business against Vancouver and won at least one of those overtime games to move on and ruin Vancouver's Cinderella story. We've taken a look at the Red Wings and their 96 season, in which they should have done better and all that if it wasn't for that pesky Patrick Roy. We saw many other teams play, like the Sharks. What if they didn't blow that 3-0 series lead in 2014? Or the Colorado Avalanche. What if Patrick Roy retired in a better light? But rest assured, there's one team left, and it's the blue and white baby. That's right, the Toronto Maple Leafs are the focus for this What If. And we're going to go through what should have been the greatest Leaf moment of all time, one of the best finals of all time. Everyone knows the Leafs have the longest cup drought and the longest finals drought in the NHL. Fortunately, not in the four major sports, as 10 teams have had longer droughts than the Toronto Maple Leafs. But the fact of the matter is that I'm going to talk about the one time that the Toronto Maple Leafs should have made the finals and should have made Canada proud. This is the story of the 1993 Toronto Maple Leafs. Hello out there, we're on the air. It's Cutter, What If NHL time. Tensions blow, the whistle blown, and the pucks go down the ice. Some teams just want to win the cup and do it with a smile. Hey, that is cool. Up on the River Nile. Oh, the good old hockey game. Who will come out on top? Will a team get through the cup to the cup by any means necessary? Oh, the good old hockey game. It's the best game you can name. And I'm have no shame. I will simulate those hockey games. Woo! Now, as a Leaf fan, I know that I'm going to be rambling on and on and on. So I will try my best to talk about the Leafs' history in quite a way. Toronto was one of the original NHL teams. Well, the city of Toronto, with Ottawa and Montreal for the 1917-18 season. And then, 10 years later, in 1927, Conn Smythe actually bought interest in the Toronto organization. They were actually planning to move to Philadelphia, truth be told. Anyhow, so Conn Smythe bought the team, changed the colors from the green and white of the Toronto St. Pats to the blue and white of the Toronto Maple Leafs, of course, as you see here. It's not, of course, 1927 style, but whatever. But the fact of the matter is that the Maple Leafs were born, in a sense. In 1932, they won the championship, taking care of business against the New York Rangers. The Leafs would keep making finals in the 30s, but kept missing out on cups for some strange reason. They were one of the most snake-bit teams of any decade. In the 30s, they kept making finals, but they just couldn't win titles. It took until 1942 to finally win another title, and that was when the Leafs came back from 3-0 down to Detroit in the Cup Finals and did the reverse sweep. The Leafs were decent. In 1945, they took care of a very powerful Montreal Canadiens team in the semifinals, went to the finals against Detroit, and almost got reverse swept themselves. But fortunately, Babe Pratt scored a Game 7 goal to win the game. The Leafs three-peated, becoming the first team to three-peat in NHL history, 47, 48, and 49. Then after a year off in 1951, Bill Barilko scored a powerful goal in which he actually joined the Rush, which was shocking. But the fact of the matter was that he did it, and the Leafs won the Stanley Cup. And then for 11 years, the Leafs just couldn't get anywhere near that cup. They won the cup in 62 against the Blackhawks. Contrary to what popular belief about the Bill Barilko incident was that they found Barilko a few months after the Leafs won the cup in 1962. They found him and his companion, Dr. Henry Hudson, on a plane, and their skeletal remains were intact in seatbelts. It was like, how did they not find that airplane for 11 years? Doesn't make sense. But nevertheless, the Leafs were dominant in the 60s. They three-peated in 62, 63, and 64. A few off years, and then 1967, they won the Stanley Cup over the Canadiens, and it looked like the Leafs were good. They won their 13th title as a franchise, 11th as the Maple Leafs, but 13th overall. And they were tied with Montreal for the Cup lead. A lot of people forget that the Leafs and Habs were tied with 13 cups in 1967 until, Montreal won 11 in the past, in a 26-year period, and the Leafs didn't even sniff the final. So a lot of Leafs playoff failures happened. Some of the most significant ones was 1971 when the Leafs took on the New York Rangers, lost in 6 games thanks to Bob Nevin scoring the overtime goal, ex-Leaf. But was bigger than that was that Vic Hadfield actually threw Bernie Perron's mask into the MSG stands and all that. That was the year that the Leafs had both Bernie Perron and Jacques Plante in the playoffs. It's amazing. Perron would go on to do big things with the Flyers in the 70s. And Jacques Plante was a legend for the Canadiens in the 50s and early 60s. And anyhow, the Leafs looked pretty impressive that year. 1976, they had a famous series with the Philadelphia Flyers in the quarterfinals, in which it went 7 games. Red Kelly, the coach, decided to use pyramid power. Darryl Sittler put up a 5-goal performance on Perron in Game 6, forcing a Game 7, but the Flyers went on home turf. The Habs would take care of them in the final, but still. 1979, even though the Leafs got swept by the Canadiens, people were upset about the ending when there was a controversial penalty on Tiger Williams, and then Larry Robinson, former Kitchener Ranger, scored in overtime to sink the Leafs. But, it's a Habs. 1986, the Leafs come out of freaking nowhere to win a playoff series and then take St. Louis to Game 7. If they had won Game 7, they would have faced the Calgary Flames in the Stanley Cup semifinals. 1987, the Leafs having a 3-1 series lead against the Detroit Red Wings in the division final. All they needed to do was win 1 game and probably get their ass whipped by the Edmonton Oilers, but at least they make the Final Four. But no, they screwed up. 1988 was when Leaf fans finally decided to start a tradition which has been done many times since. Throw their jerseys on the ice. And then the Leafs were having struggled. Well, they struggled in the 80s because Harold Ballard was just being a giant prick, especially hiring Punch Imlach, who was trying to bring the Leafs dominance back in the 60s, but he was trying to think, yeah, there's a way to do it. Like the 1960s, fine, but you don't set your team back in the 60s because the 60s were a turbulent time for a lot of things. Won't get into that because this is sports, not politics. So, yeah, the Leafs bounced back in 1993 after some years in the wilderness. 94, they went all the way to the Final Four, lost to the Canucks in Game 5. And all that. So that was kind of an awkward moment. But yeah, the Canucks took care of the Leafs. Well, it could have been worse for the Leafs. The Sharks actually forced Toronto in Game 7 to a Game 7. 1999, the Leafs went back to the Final Four and should have taken care of Buffalo, but Buffalo had their one secret weapon, Dominik Hasek, who stymied the Leafs, and it was just basically game over. The Leafs had a good moment. 2002, they were supposed to run away with the East. They took care of the Islanders. They took care of Ottawa. They were going to take care of Carolina, everyone thought. Carolina was just lucky to be there, people said. But Anders Urbe turned into an orangutan, if you will. And, a lot of low-scoring games. The Leafs just couldn't win in overtime against Carolina in that series. And the Canes went on to the Stanley Cup final. Then the lockout happened, and the Leafs just couldn't make the playoffs for anything. 2013 strike season, Leafs do make the playoffs. They take on the Bruins. They're down 3-1. They come back to force a Game 7, and it looked pretty impressive. But all of a sudden, 4-1, third period, Leaf fans know what I'm talking about. Non-Leaf fans should know that the Leafs were up 4-1 on Boston in Game 7 and choked it. Bergeron scoring in overtime. And then the Leafs, ever since 2017, have made the playoffs. They have the longest current active playoff streak, as of this taping, of course. 2017 took Washington to overtime 5 times out of 6 to tie the NHL record for most overtimes in a playoff series, but the Leafs lost in 6. 2018, the Bruins beat the Leafs after they failed to capitalize on a third period lead in Boston again. 2019, same old song. 2020, the pandemic year, the Leafs couldn't beat the Blue Jackets. Of all teams, the Columbus Blue Jackets? 2021, 3-1 series lead on the Canadiens, our hated rivals, but John Tavares got hurt by Corey Perry in game 1 of the series, and Carey Price stood on his freaking head. I got to give my props to him. But the fact of the matter was that the Leafs choked it and probably would have taken care of the Jets in round 2. In 2022, they faltered to the Lightning on home ice. 2023, we thought that was the same old song, but a pair of overtime wins in Tampa. We were up 3-1, lost game 5, but won game 6. John Tavares kind of on a wraparound scored, and the 19-year jinx was over. We finally won a playoff series. Then the Florida Panthers tore us apart, even though we won at Florida more than Boston. Leafs losing to Boston, I can take it. Losing to Florida, should have had it. 2024, the Leafs faltered again in the playoffs. Why can I not remember who they lost to? I say Tampa. I think it was Tampa. Who sunk us in 2024? I can't remember. And that was last year. But nevertheless, 2025, the Leafs took care of the Senators in the playoffs. And it was over. We were going to face Florida, get revenge for what happened 2 years prior. But no, game 7, nightmare. 7-1, no, 6-1 was the final score. Brad the Rat Marchand scoring a pair of goals. So anyway, the Leafs had a chance. The Panthers making the finals against the Oilers. That should have been us. At least we made the finals. But nevertheless, let's talk about the 93 Leafs. So anyway, the 1993 Toronto Maple Leafs, their 76th season in the NHL. Tom Watt was fired on May the 4th. He just wasn't there. And then May 29th, the Leafs were shocked when Pat Burns quit his role as Montreal head coach. He was practically going to be fired. Serge Savard was going to fire Pat Burns because he just couldn't get Montreal over the hump over Boston in the playoffs. It used to be a gimme, Montreal taking care of Boston in the playoffs. So Pat Burns decided to quit before he was fired and then signed a 4-year deal with the Leafs, which was shocking that we stole Montreal's head coach. Ha 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 ha. In the regular season, the Leafs won the most games, 44, and got 99 points. But the Puck ain't won. Hit me. Anyway, the Leafs made a massive trade in February, trading Grant Fuhr, who was going to be the Leafs star goalie. And, he won 5 cups with the Oilers. But he wasn't the best goalie for the Leafs. But the Leafs traded him to Buffalo for Dave Vanderchuk, Darren Pupa, and a first-round pick, which was Kenny Janssen, which was a good pick until we traded him to the Islanders. Dave Vanderchuk put up 54 goals that season, 29 with Buffalo, 25 with us. And Darren Pupa was a reliable backup for Felix Potvin because the Leafs figured Potvin deserved to be the goalie of the future, and he was second in Calder Trophy voting. All that. The Leafs had the second fewest goals allowed in the season. Only Chicago and Ed Belfour did that. The Leafs had the defense core of Dave Ellett, Todd Gill, who was redeeming himself in Toronto's eyes after that terrible giveaway in 1989 that got the Blackhawks to the playoffs. Sylvain Lefebvre, former Hab, Jamie McCowan, Dmitry Mironov, and Bobby Rels, former Red Wing. So yeah, Vanderchuk did his job. Nikolai Borshevsky actually scored 34 goals and was the goal-scoring leader. Wow, Vanderchuk played for 2 teams. All that. Doug Gilmour had a breakout year, 127 points. Was the runner-up for the regular season MVP to Mario Lemieux. But I mean, come on, Mario came back from cancer and still won the scoring title. Gilmour did win the Selke for best defensive forward, the Bob Gainey Trophy. and all that. There were a lot of things going on. Off the ice, there was a lot of problems. So, anyway, the Leafs did not allow beer sales and all that. By 1992, only them and the Delta Center in Salt Lake City banned alcohol sales for obvious reasons with Utah because it's a Mormon controlled state. It was weird how there would be a lot of beer advertisements at Maple Leaf Gardens, but they couldn't sell the beer in the ice. Anyway, the Leafs finally got their beer January 1993, although they were probably overpriced. The Leafs ended up third in the North Division behind Chicago and Detroit. Chicago looked strong with Ed Belfour, and they were defending conference champs. The Red Wings were coming back from being called the Dead Things, and the Blues beat the North Stars by 3 points to get the fourth spot, and the North Stars would move to Dallas. Remember, the playoffs happened. Detroit, Toronto. Detroit was up 2-0. Toronto won the next three, including Game 5. Mike Foligno's overtime goal, doing the jumping in the air and all that. Detroit won in Toronto in Game 6, and then Game 7 happened overtime when Nikolai Borshevsky got a stick in front of a Bob Rouse shot and deflected it past Tim Shovelday, and the Leafs were going to the second round for the first time in 6 years. They took on the St. Louis Blues, who somehow shocked the Chicago Blackhawks in the first round, beating them in 4 games. The Leafs would win Game 1 thanks to Doug Gilmour's wraparound goal in double overtime. Ironically, the Blues would get a double overtime goal of their own. Despite all that, Cujo, future Leaf, would actually put up great efforts and all that. In Game 7, the Leafs hosted St. Louis because they had the better points record, of course, and crushed them 6-0. Then they would take on the LA Kings and Wayne Gretzky in the conference finals. It was weird, Gretzky versus Toronto. Gretzky loved playing in Toronto. It was a huge series. Marty McSorley with that hit on Doug Gilmour in Game 1. Wendell Clark defending his teammate. And then Pat Burns trying to get at Barry Melrose for that move and all that. Toronto won Game 5 in overtime thanks to Glenn Anderson's goal. And the Leafs, all they needed to do was win in LA. They were going to go to the Stanley Cup Finals. Montreal was waiting. And then Game 6 happened when Gretzky got no penalty for what he did to Gilmour. Never mind a 5-minute major and probably being thrown out of the game. He should have just gone in 2 minutes because, you never know what could happen and all that. Kerry Fraser said that the stick came on the follow through and all that. Fraser even said he should have called some kind of penalty. And then moments later, he scored in overtime to force a Game 7 back in Toronto and all that. I mean, if the Leafs still lost, when Gretzky take a penalty, even if the Leafs lost, then it takes the sting off things. But Game 7, Gretzky puts up his hat trick, including the bank shot off Dave Ellett's skate. Leafs lose 5-4 and lose a chance to have a true Stanley Cup final in the Centennial. The Leafs and Habs. So yeah, they lost the first 2 games, won the next 3. Got their butt handed to them on home turf. And then Game 7. It was a tough series. They did have a couple of key wins. When the Leafs won, it was either by double overtime or by blowing out the Blues. And then against the Kings, they did that. The worst part was they had to play every other day. No 2-day break between games, if you will, like most series nowadays. Goaltending, Potsdam was 25-15-7 in 48 games. Grant Fuhr played 29 games before he was traded, 13-9-4. Pupa was 6-2 as the backup. Rick Walmsley sucked. Pupa only played 1 period in the playoffs. Pat Burns was named the Jack Adams Award for Coach of the Year. And Gilmour would set records for assists in 1 game, most points in 1 season, 127, and most points by center. The Leafs traded Brad Marsh to the expansion Ottawa Senators. They picked up Sylvain Lefebvre from Montreal for a third-round pick, which ended up being nothing. They picked up Johnny Cullen from Hartford for a second-round pick, which was kind of nothing. They did that Amtrak trade. And then February 25th, they traded away a ninth round pick to Ottawa. And weirdly enough, that was Pavel Dimitra. So Ottawa drafted Pavel Dimitra in the ninth round. Remember him? They picked up Bob McGill from the Lightning on waivers. They lost Darren Pupa and Joe Sacco to the expansion draft, but, you know, they didn't need to worry. Felix Potvin was going to be a net. And then the 92 draft, they got Brendan Convery 8th overall, not really helping. Grant Marshall was picked in the first round, but he would do much better in Dallas. Nikolai Borshevsky, 4th round pick, which was huge. The rookie with the goal scorer in Game 7. Unbelievable, he kept saying. And all that. Yeah, Ryan Vanderbush, future Florida Panther. So that's the story of the 93 Leafs. Now let's see what happened in the Stanley Cup Finals. All right, so here it is, the Stanley Cup Finals that we all wanted to see. Canadians and Americans alike. Montreal, Toronto, just like it should be. Famous rivalry, the Stanley Cup Centennial year because it started in 1893. Montreal, Toronto, it was just right there for the picking. Montreal was actually down 2-0 in their first round series, as well as the Leafs. But that was to Quebec, and a lot of people thought Red Light Rosico should be in net. Yeah, right. You trust Andre Rosico? Nevertheless, Waugh repaid his coach's patience by taking care of things. Montreal winning 4 straight games in that series, sweeping the Buffalo Sabres in the second round, and then taking care of the New York Islanders in 5 games. Along the way, they got 11 consecutive wins, which tied an NHL record. So Waugh versus Pot then. Quebec versus Quebec, if you will. Great matchup. Game 1. Game 1 saw the Habs come into Toronto and win 5-2. Kevin Haller, if you hear me, made it 1-0. Wendell Clark tied it at 1, and then Stefan LeBeau made it 2-1. Tyler LeBeau on the tree. Anyway, the third period, Kirk Muller scoring to make it 3-1. John Cullen, who later would have cancer, the same cancer I think that Lemieux had. He made it 3-2. Fanny Dompoos, former Leaf. People forget that Vince Dompoos was a Leafs goal-scoring icon before he was traded to Edmonton in the trade that got Grant Fuhrer coming there. And then Dompoos was traded to Montreal before the 93 season. Brian Bellows, Kitchener. Sorry, I always say that when a former Kitchener Ranger does something in hockey. Brian Bellows made it 5-2, and that was it. 3 stars, Patrick Waugh, Kevin Haller, and Vinny Dompoos. Yeah, Kevin Haller, the second star of all people. Round 2 saw the Leafs lose 5-3 this time, as Dompoos made it 1-0, trying to sink his former team. Ed Roden made it 2-0. John Cullen made it 2-1. Has made it 3-1 on a goal by Matthew Schneider, future Leaf. Brian Bellows, Kitchener, made it 4-1. Mike Krushelewski scoring 4-2. Remember him, Leaf fans? And then Kirk Muller made it 5-2. Grant Fuhrer was replacing the net. Of course, this engine is biased because it has everyone who played for the 93 Leafs, because they don't have the final rosters, because everyone knows Grant Fuhrer was traded. Nevertheless, he was in that, and then Dave Vanderchuk made it 5-3 for the Leafs, but then nothing else happened. Schneider, Muller, and Dompoos are your 3 stars. So Montreal up 2-0, headed to Game 3. And the Leafs did to Montreal what Montreal did to Toronto. Win on 4 nights. Kirk Muller made it 1-0 for Montreal. Then John Cullen made it 1-1. And then it was 2-1 for the Canadiens through 2 periods. But then the Leafs went ape in the second period. Bill Berg made it 2-2. Good waiver. Of course, Bill Berg is the word. Dougie Gilmour made it 3-2. Andrew Chuck made it 4-2. That's a great trade. And Doug Gilmour made it 5-2 while it was chased. And then Bill Berg did it again. 2 goals. Of all people. Potvin, Gilmour, and Bill Berg, your 3 stars. Well, Berg's got 2 goals. So Frederick Chabot actually faced 28 shots in 28 minutes, with Waugh only having 20 shots against in 31 minutes. Should mention the Montreal players. Schneider, Desjardins, Muller, Dompoos, Odeline, LeBeau, Haller, Gary Lehman, former 50 goal scorer for the Leafs. Mike Keane, Carbonneau, Danny Savard, the legend Gilbert Dion, another Kitchener Ranger, with Bellows, Ed Ronan, JJ Danino, Benoit Brouet, Paul DiPietro, who was a playoff hero in Game 6 against the Nordiques, Patrice Brisebois, a young Brisebois, Mario Roberge, a young John Leclerc. Bet you forgot that John Leclerc was a Montreal Canadien. I wouldn't blame you. And of course, the Leafs with Doug Gilmour, Wendell Clark, Gill, Dave Ellett, Dmitry Mironov, Jamie McCowan, Nikolai Borshevsky, Sylvain Lefebvre, John Cullen, Mike Krzyzewski, Bob Rouse, Davey Anderchuk, Peter Cecil, Bill Berg, Glenn Anderson, Mike Foligno, Robbie Pearson, Bob McGill, Derek Berehowski, and Joe Sacco. That's right. The Boston Bruins head coach was a Toronto Maple Leaf at one time. I even have his rookie card. I think I do. Anyway, game 4. So the Leafs do it again, 6-1. The only half goal was Matthew Schneider, and that made it 6-1. Borshevsky, Clark, Anderchuk, Clark, Foligno, and Krzyzewski were the goal scorers. Yeah, Borshevsky, unbelievable, unbelievable. Clark, Anderchuk, Gilmour, your 3 stars. So the series heads back to Toronto for Game 5, and the Leafs lose again. What is it with the road teams? Gilbert Dion, Kitchener made it 1-0. John Cullen tied it 1. Don Poos made it 2-1. Cecil made it 2-2. RIP. Desjardins made it 3-2, and it was not a hat trick goal. Kirk Muller made it 4-2, and then made it 5-2. Future Leaf, Kirk Muller, of course. Muller won. Don Poos were your 3 stars. Wild faced 49 shots. Game 6 in Montreal, and the same old song. The Leafs were up 3-1 after 1 period. Anderson, Dompoos, and Borshevsky scoring. Sorry, Anderson, Borshevsky scoring. Dompoos was from Montreal. Toronto was up 3-1. Unfortunately, Bellows made it 3-2, and then Dennis Savard made it 3-3, and then Borshevsky at 117 from Gilmour and Clark scored the hat trick goal, and again scored overtime goals. So we are going to Game 7. Now, I forgot to mention that Toronto's the home team because they scored 99 points. Montreal only scored 98. Borshevsky, Potvin, and Clark are your 3 stars. Well, Borshevsky, I mean, dude, you had to give it to him. So Game 7 in Toronto. I'm not making this shit up. And wouldn't you know it, dreams do come true in this game. Toronto, Montreal. Denny Savard made it 1-0, proving how good he was, even though that he was bigger in Chicago. Doug Gilmour made it 1-1. Mike Keane made it 2-1. Dave Anderchuk tied it at 2. Don Poos made it 3-2. Desjardins made it 4-2. And Brian Bellows made it 5-2. And that was it. Montreal chases Potvin from the net. And John Cullen made it 5-3. And then Glenn Anderson makes it 5-4. Lots of penalties abound. And then Gilmour at 16:56 scored from Clark and Rouse. And then a dumb penalty by Eric Desjardins, of all people, for elbowing. And then Gilmour had the puck. Mironov to Gilmour slices it in, and Doug Gilmour gives the 1993 Toronto Maple Leafs the Stanley Cup. The Leafs ended up winning the Stanley Cup, doing it in overtime of Game 7. I think this engine knew what I was up to, but yeah, it's weird that Toronto lost Potvin and they still won the game. It looked like it was going to be Montreal crushing Toronto. You can't make this stuff up. Montreal only threw 25 shots on Fuhr and Potvin. They threw 57 on Waugh. Gilmour, Desjardins, and Bellows are your 3 stars. Bellows, I kind of doubt. He did score a goal and assist, but like, Steve LeBeau should have done it, if anything. So yeah, the Toronto Maple Leafs would have won the Stanley Cup in 1993 against Montreal. A lot of people probably say that if you played it from a Montreal point of view, it would be Montreal. I don't care what you think. I don't care what y'all think. Y'all are just jealous. I don't know. So anyway, that's it for NHL What Ifs. Hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond. I do